All right, welcome to my kitchen here in Brooklyn, Fort Greene. My name is Joost. I'm going to be talking a little bit about video games for the next 25 minutes. I have about 60 slides, 62 slides. So it's going to go fast, but that, of course, is what you'd expect. My first thing, of course, is to kind of tell you who I am, give you a little bit of background as to why you should listen to me at all. And it has everything to do with the last 20 years of my career, both as an academic and an entrepreneur in video games. Quite a bit of time writing a dissertation on the topic, of course. I wrote a book on it, and then also teach at NYU at the business school there currently on the business of video games, as you could expect. I was also the co-founder and CEO of a company called Superdata, where most of my day I would spend with big finance firms, big publishers, and helping them understand the digital ecosystem, the digital space, as it started to become a more relevant component to business. So I've been part of a lot of conversations. And I find that very interesting, right? For me personally, it's been a fascinating topic. And for that very reason, I also wanted to give a quick shout out to Danuka, Chris, Sarah, Marshall, Danny, and Steven for setting this up and providing me with a platform to speak to all of you today a little bit about video games and why I think they're fascinating. It's I think a rather interesting topic when it comes to the intersection of culture, entertainment, technology, and what proof we might find in video games that we could then lay out for other categories and verticals. So without much further ado, I really want to kind of get started on this idea that it's not an intuitively type of topic that you will have a discussion with your boss if you are working with a big brand, if you are part of a big sports company. And a lot of the experience I had after selling the business to Nielsen was talking to large firms, large brands, and helping them navigate their way in the game space. It's a really interesting thing to think about. How do we now manage our way in this new ecosystem? And for me personally, that's not a conversation that's new. That's a conversation I've been having my entire life. Like, why on earth would you study video games at all? What's the merit that it deserves? Like, why does it deserve academic inquiry of a serious nature? And so in many ways, it's I've been rolling this ball uphill my entire career. So I'm very excited, of course, to see then that the industry is growing, that it's accelerating. And that's kind of where I want to start. So to break this out for all of you, I have three sections that I prepared, starting really with like an overview of the ecosystem. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how gamers and game companies, think about problems, how they solve them, and how they deal with strategic challenges in a creative fashion. And then finally, of course, gamers are the vanguard of the consumer audience, of a media audience, of what in their early behaviors can we see now, from which we can deduct what the future will look like later. So starting at the top, we see an acceleration in growth, right? So if I lay it out from 1985, the first Super Mario game that I ever touched, all the way to today, you see steady growth to the first, say, 10, 20 years, but really the last 10, 15 years where you see a 5x growth factor in terms of revenue. Does that matter? Well, it kind of matters in the sense that as things become bigger, they tend to change, right? One of my favorite principles when it comes to large industries or growth in an industry or growth in an organization is, as things become larger, their makeup also changes. And so you see, of course, companies like Microsoft and Sony, the Nintendos of the world, the incumbents, if you will, really come at the industry very differently today than they did 10, 20 years ago, because they're now catering to 3 billion people, right? No longer are they relegated to the fringes of entertainment. They're now front and center in how people spend their time and their money. Of course, the natural question that follows today would be, well, isn't that because of COVID? Isn't that because we've all been locked up in our house and trying to get away from whoever we're with, at least for a brief moment? And to some degree, that's fair. Of course, it's an accelerant in that sense. The lockdown and the pandemic have really resulted in a lot of people spending more time with their devices. But this is something that's been going on for a long time. Right? So the transition to digital has been something that's underway now for well over a decade. And it's really that slow, gradual motion forward that has peaked, I guess, in 2020, so to put it that way, and say it penetrated sort of the collective consciousness. And now we understand, that video games are this fun thing that you can do. It allows us to connect with others on the internet, and really just have a really good time. The biggest thing then is to To give you a little bit of context, is that games sit side by side with other forms of entertainment, and one of them is, of course, music. The other one is video. And what distinguishes games to me is that it is populated by executives, decision makers, and creatives that see digitalization not so much as a threat, but really as an opportunity. So, in the traditional, more conventional industries, you will find that music never quite liked the internet because that was a scary thing, and it was riddled with piracy. Video is, of course, about very aggressively managing your IP. And it ends up being something that is very hard to navigate if you're in that mindset. The games companies of the world, they never quite saw it that way, and they really managed to make the most of it very early on. Of course, then, if I lay that out in terms of revenue models, you see that over the last 20 years, the growth really has come from this idea of games as a service. So no longer are we thinking about or talking about buying a disc at GameStop and sticking a cartridge in your Nintendo system. It's really about downloading content, either paid for or free, and then adding additional content to it in a digital fashion through microtransactions, through digital downloads, level packs, battle passes, what have you. That's really where the growth factor has been, and that's where you see that immense acceleration in the industry come from. What underlies all that is, of course, the fact that we are able to connect with each other. If you recall 2004, 2005, around the launch of World of Warcraft, this is a game that very quickly, that at its launch as a online multiplayer game, a lot of people, I should say, the developer expected to sell maybe 400,000 units by the end of the year, and they sold it within the first month because people were so excited to be able to play with their friends online. And so what you have effectively in the games industry is an incredible capitalization on network effects, right? No longer is it just one publisher talking to millions of individuals separately, but they now all contribute to the value of the game and the online experience, and they share that online. And so it's really the other people in the room that create a large part of the value. And you see that then, of course, reflected in the reach of some of these companies, right? So if you really just go to the top level here, 200 million people on a monthly active basis, that's a lot of people to be reaching with very simple games, right? We're talking PC games, we're talking mobile games. These are free to play in nature most of the time. You see in Activision Blizzard with Candy Crush, but through its King subsidiary, reaching 150 million people a month. That's a lot of people, right? Which is not just a great number, they're also dispersed throughout all over the globe. So in many ways, it's a very new model to think about as you start creating content, as you start to invest in companies around it. How do you make something that's interesting to that many people? How does that come about? One of the new components, which I'm sure many of us at South by are really familiar with, is of course live streaming nowadays. So the influencer component to the story. What's interesting to me is when Amazon acquired Twitch in 2014, they did so, I think, kind of on a whim. They bought it right from under Google's nose, and they did so very successfully, and now have all these friendly blue-haired people promoting games. In 2020, we see almost doubling of viewership, right? So we have incredible number of eyeballs, and it's no longer only gamers. It's now all of these other categories as well. In particular, political candidates. I thought it was very interesting to see AOC fumble around with a microphone recently, and trying to come to terms with a larger conversation and inviting speakers in. I think that that's a very interesting format in that it's not just allowing us to have this simultaneous experience where we can just all share and in real time communicate and enjoy this. At the same time, it also creates a whole new marketing wing. Right? The traditional way of doing marketing in the business, like video games, which is generally 50% of the budget, now moves over to a whole new category. And so that's what you just see in Twitch, but you see it also in the Asian markets, right? So this is a global phenomenon in the sense that it's, Bilibili is a juggernaut of a platform. We have Huya, we have Douyu, owned for 2/3 by Tencent, and it's become not just like a nice business to have. You start to see that this really evolves as like a critical component to everything. And that then is really the message of, in terms of the market segment, right? It's that gaming is now a mainstream form of entertainment, but now that we are catering to a mainstream audience, things have changed. It's no longer the same. So to give you a sense of what that looks like in the mind of gamers, and sort of from an academic angle, and then bringing it back to the industry, I think it's interesting to give you some sort of, a bit of theory here and say, well, most of the time games aren't just, mechanics where we count things, or, my sword is bigger than yours, so I will always beat you. Games tend to be, or at least the phenomenon of play in a culture tends to be around much larger set of beliefs, practices, and habits. So if we look, for instance, at backgammon, where you play, roll some dice, where you are, trying to get your stones from one place to the next. It teaches some really fundamental social political components, right? If you are a single stone by yourself, and it's sort of modeled on the, individual tent out in the desert, that's something that's, of course, a moment of vulnerability. You're much better off clumping together as a group. And so that is a simple rule that you see reflected in the game. The roll of the dice, God's will, if Allah wills it, right? Inshallah. That's really sort of the random factor here. And so as things progress throughout the game, you are taught some of the fundamental principles that govern not just, of course, the microcosm of a game, but speaks to the much larger world around it. We can make fun of that, of course, right? Chess has a similar sort of emphasis on hierarchy, on monarchy, and it gives us a sense of structure, and it speaks to, and it's an obvious manifestation of the societies in which they occur. And for me, then, to kind of get to the point here, is to say that games often provide epistemic access to very large abstractions that govern and impact our day-to-day life, to which we have no real access. And that's a really interesting thing, right? And it's, how do we make sense of a Middle Eastern geopolitical conflict that makes it so that's on the news all the time, that's in my world, but I can't really make it tangible? Identity is another one of those frontiers where you see a lot of change. There's a lot of discussions around it, but now we can, for the first time, really make use of the affordance of the elasticity of games, creating different ways to present ourselves in a digital environment. What is it like? Who do I want to be? If I had free range of being anyone, which in and of itself is a wildly interesting philosophical idea, then who will I be, right? So in Cyberpunk, what's my main character and what are they about? And of course, then there is the logic of gaming the universe in general, right? So we saw most recently with GameStop, you see millions of people all buying itty bitty shares of GameStop, and thereby disrupting, the normal cadence of work on Wall Street. So for me, then, that's the phenomenon of the games, the mindset, right? Sort of figuring out ideas and coming up with solutions in a creative fashion. At the same time, you see the conventional media industry kind of falling on top of itself, right? There was no one in the room when Kylie Jenner had this idea about Pepsi. Like, no interns stood up and said, like, please, Lord, let's not do this. But they did. And the same of it could be, you see Moses coming down the mountain and say, like, here is the thing that everybody's going to want. And $1.8 billion later, nobody wanted it. And Magic Leap is a whole other version of that, right? So you see these sort of archaic ways of doing business, and it starts to become not so much a joke in and of itself, but you start to see that the way of doing business and dealing with strategy becomes outdated, right? So one form in which I believe that games industries have really been on the cutting edge of innovation is that they are very, very clever when it comes to organizing their talent. Talent is everything. And so they organize themselves in a way where they give them as much flexibility as they want. Companies like Valve, which are generating about $5 billion a year, they do so because they have a very flat structure, right? Employees are capable and allowed to do whatever they do, and they have to, of course, account for it. But there is not some weird hierarchical structure. They give them a lot of room to move around. Supercell, one of the most popular mobile game companies in the world, with not one but $4 billion franchises on its name, what they do is they give people a lot of freedom to build things, right? Hence the name Supercell. Like, everything is small groups of people building creatively. And so really the more you give people access and resources, the better a company tends to function in the games industry. We also have to consider, of course, retail in that context. Like, conventional industries have been having a really hard time after years of declining sales and sort of poor managing of capital investments. Toys R Us finally bit the dust, but it also did so, and what really probably was the final straw was things like fidget spinners, which don't really require a lot of pretext to get to market very quickly. They were super popular, and they go entirely against the grain when it comes to conventional toy design, toy manufacturing, toy distribution, and marketing, right? So while that is a really sluggish 2-3 year process, all of a sudden fidget spinners just hit them sideways, and so that doesn't help if you're in the toy business, if you totally miss out on these big trends. Amazon, of course, is always the big culprit in that context, and you see all these different retailers having a hard time with that. And then games retail seems to be still alive. So in many ways, I believe that GameStop is not so much a promising company for the future, but it's managed to do so well as opposed to a Tower Records or opposed to a Radio Shack, because it has a really well thought out, innovative business model around used game sales. It knows exactly its customer base, and it's very aggressive when it comes to, knowing that it's not the 14-year-old that's buying the games, it's mom and dad, right? The aisles are big enough for strollers. Every store has a ramp. They invite people in a very accessible way, removing all of the barriers that you would have from entering this weird video game store. So it's a very innovative way in terms of retail. And of course, it goes hand in hand with the ongoing narrative of console gaming being on its way out. For the last 20 years now, we've been talking about this, and it never comes to pass. And that has a lot, I think, to do with the fact that, well, we do see new technologies pop up and new competitors, make haste. At the same time, it's really the incumbents that then become clever and say, well, what if we add digital services? And during the launch of the PlayStation 5, you see this immediately, that there's a lot of success around the device. There's a lot of success around the new Xboxes. The Nintendo Switch sells really, really well. And it has a lot to do with the fact that most of their revenue now comes from digital. So they're no longer really beholden to that huge, big red streak that follows the launch of new hardware. What really happens is that Sony, in this case, for instance, according to its most recent financial reporting, they managed to break that cycle. You see here in the graph, you see here the red lines. Like every time they launch a new device, it goes way into the red, and then slowly, by selling software, kind of breaks out of it again. Because they now have digital services, because they have PlayStation Plus, there's like 48 million subscribers, they have PlayStation Now. All of that amounts to a situation where a conventional industry now has all these additional revenue streams, and they mitigate risk much better. That's not just interesting to note, but it's also, this happens on a billion-dollar scale, right? So making $23 billion a year in the case of Sony from its PlayStation division, that's a really big tanker to turn around, and they managed to do that. So for me, that's a really interesting sort of mindset, right? You have the gamers on the one hand, and then you have the companies on the other hand, where things really turn around and they manage to think creatively about strategic challenges. So then where does that leave us for the future? Like, what's the thing to come? My mind goes to examples from the work that I've done over the past. And for instance, working with a company like PayPal. PayPal is one of those firms that spun off of eBay, if you recall, and since then has managed to become much, much more valuable. And they managed to do so because they've convinced lots of people that they should be used as a payment platform, right? And I won't speak so much to the merits of PayPal in of itself, but what they've done well is, or partly contributed to that success, was their ability to use and leverage and identify gamers as sort of that vanguard consumer group. They knew that there was lots of people out there that needed to somehow pay for games online. They had some real dollars, they had some credit cards they could use, and that's how they could get people to create PayPal accounts. And then from that moment on, they started to spend all kinds of money on different categories like travel, e-commerce, and so on. So gaming really became that sort of entry point for a lot of people, a lot of consumers, like, into online spending. And you find then that that's what gamers do well. They're very tech savvy. They're easily motivated to experiment with things. They're willing to take a chance on things. And that's interesting to me because you also see that now in the moment of the industry switching to a new console platform. There's a lot of hubbub going on in mobile. Suddenly we have Amazon, we have Google, and they're trying to take some of their internal capacities in terms of infrastructure, bandwidth, their cloud gaming facilities, and say, well, we should be part of this. We want to be part of this as well. And they're starting to break into it. Suddenly gaming has become interesting enough for, I guess, the soon to be retired Jeff Bezos to be part of that conversation, right? Whereas previously that wasn't the case. And I think it's quite a feat when all of a sudden you have not two or three, but several billion-dollar companies looking to become a dominant platform. And that, of course, then leads to the inevitable circumstance where you have lots of billionaires trying to duke it out, right? We now have a conversation between Epic Games and Apple. Like, well, what's a fair rate in the App Store? And that's going to be an interesting thing to watch, because everybody loves sort of like a, mano a mano combat between a bunch of dudes in the industry that get to say and do everything they want. At the same time, it's going to change drastically, of course, the platonic, create a shift in the platonic setup. That's going to, I think, affect a lot of the conversations around creativity and, of course, strategic challenges in the future. So I'll give you a quick run through in the remaining minutes that I have to give an indication of how the industry will look based on consumer behavior. And so at the center, I still believe that there's going to be play, right? The one thing that we all like to do is play, experiment, navigate, explore a space, and do that together. So this is my little family here in Brooklyn. My kid is superb at Mario Kart and Super Smash. So, all contenders are invited to come lose. But it's an interesting thing. It's a really sort of intimate space, and that's an instinct that I think is universal, irrespective of history or cultural moment. And so that's going to continue to progress and be part of everything. But the next piece immediately that follows is, of course, people like to socialize, right? We want to go to sports events. We want to hang out together. We want to talk about it and share this experience. So this is an example from a convention in Germany. People like to hang out together and really just talk about games. Pokemon Go, they organize these big fests. People come together, I guess, in the pre-corona universe, and they hang out and they all share this love for this one game, this one franchise, this character, what have you. And we saw so, of course, during the pandemic, that lots of people would turn to Animal Crossing New Horizon to have this sort of parallel universe life. And that's where they would come together, because they couldn't meet in person. The next thing over is, of course, like, okay, well, I'll take a more passive approach. I want to watch. So you see people watching over each other's shoulder. You see them watch collectively. 2 blocks from my house, we have the Barclays Center. Thousands of people come together to celebrate and enjoy things that they don't get to do anywhere else, right? And they kind of come out of their bedrooms and they come out in public, and it's okay to hang out and spend time together on this. We can do this online. We see the music business, we see entertainment companies trying to figure out, how do we have performances, album releases in the games industry, in these online universes that make sense for us and that kind of cross the bridge between the two categories. Of course, all of that then translates into spending. And then if we're talking about spending in two ways, of course, we have all of the fixins. I want to get the cool mechanical keyboard that's $150. I want to get the cool glowing lights thing, the special mouse with the buttons. But I also want to spend a lot of time, right? You play a game of like Path of Exile. That's just suffering made real. And it's just an endless grind, but that's what people like to do. They really want to spend their time and their money in this thing. So I believe then that the next logical step is that we're going to see, what YouTube was for video. We're going to see things like Manticore and Roblox, and they're going to be that for games. They're going to incentivize and they're going to cultivate creation where people want to not just play the game, they want to play with the game. They want to take it apart. They want to put it together in different ways and make new experiences, right? Come up with new ideas. And it's not just that I think that's a great idea. We're going to see the IPO of Roblox, which is valued at like 30 billion ridiculous dollars this year already. And so that's going to bring a lot of this to the foreground for people. And I think it's going to be a seismic shift there as well, because all of a sudden people are going to get that user-generated content is a big deal, right? In the words of one of the VPs at EA, we created 5,000 assets for The Sims, and our community created 6 times, 7 times that amount. And so there's just no way that a commercial organization can keep up with the kind of volume and the production of that. That leaves us then with really participation, right? And we have like sort of a different set of layers that we have. On the one hand, participation in the sense of Twitch plays Pokemon. We all collectively influence this game and see how it goes. We see some rudimentary version here, a more fleshed out one in the form of Rival Peaks, where you have millions of people creating input into the game, and that then impacts what the main characters are doing. In this case, they're AI driven. People like to be part of stuff. They want to see themselves reflected into this, right? The same thing happens then, of course, immediately after. It's like, well, if I can impact the game, I want to take a piece of it with me. You start to see things like emergence that are starting to, get a hang of like cryptocurrencies, where suddenly now we have a secondary market emerging around digital assets, right? Games have value, cards of value. I can sell those, I can trade those. So if I put them all together, you start to see this sort of flywheel of all these different behaviors that interrelate in unique ways. And I believe that gives us at least part of a blueprint of what's to come and how consumers want to be participating in the games industry. So As I mentioned before, I'm very grateful to kind of have this opportunity to talk about these things. At the start of my semester, the one thing that unifies my class is this one question saying, by show of hands, who is, who's played Pokemon now or in the past? And I have students from all over the world. They all raise their hand. Like 90% of them raise their hand. So I don't believe that any of these behaviors are anomalies or statistical outliers. I believe that this is the shape of things to come. My name is Joost. Thank you for your time.